Hello and welcome to the CVI Talks. This episode focuses on hate crimes and issues surrounding hate crime victimization in Texas and nationally. I'm Mary Bro, the CVI Director. The Crime Victims Institute at Sam Houston State University is committed to advancing research on victimization issues in Texas. Our mission is to conduct research to examine the impact of crime on victims of all ages to promote a better understanding of victimization. We focus on improving services to crime victims by giving them a voice, and we attempt to inform victim-related policy making at the state and local levels. For over 25 years, our work has established several relationships with relevant community, criminal justice, and victim service organizations through the state of Texas and nationally. It is our hope that this information contained in this presentation video will provide you with the information and data pertaining to hate crimes from an academic and practitioner perspective.
So, hello, my name is Alyssa Linares, and I received my bachelor's in victim studies here at SAM, and I'm currently working on my master's in victim services management.
Hi, my name is Taylor. I received my bachelor's in criminal justice, minoring in forensic science, and my master's in victim services management here at Sam Houston State University, and I'm currently working on my doctorate in criminal justice and criminology.
So today with us, we have Dr. Lantz from the Florida State University and Ms. Jeanine Bias from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion here at Sam Houston State University to speak with us about hate crime victimization. Dr. Brandon Lantz is an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice and the director of Hate Crime Research and Policy Institute at Florida State University. He received his PhD from the Pennsylvania State University, during which his time was a Bureau of Justice Statistics graduate research fellow. He was recently awarded both the 2020 Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences Victimology New Scholar Award and the 2021 ACJS Academy New Scholar Award. His research interests focus on hate crime, violence, victimization, race and ethnicity, and co-offending, and has been funded by the Bureau of Justice Statistics and Mara's Voice Research Foundation, among others. His published work has appeared in a number of research outlets, including the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency, Justice Quarterly, British Journal of Criminology, Criminology and Public Policy, Psychology of Violence, and Criminal Justice and Behavior.
Jeanine Bias has spent her entire professional career spanning 20 years in higher education administration. Currently, she is an interim chief diversity officer and director of institutional diversity and inclusion, as well as Title IX coordinator at Sam Houston State University. She serves as a resource for advisement and consultation on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her responsibilities include providing leadership to investigations into allegations of discrimination, harassment, and other civil rights violations, as well as develop and facilitate university-wide training programs and activities related to Title IX, Title VII, and other equal employment opportunities, affirmative action, laws, and regulations.
So the first question will be for Ms. Bias. Can you speak on your background as the Director of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion and Title IX Coordinator?
Sure. So I've been in higher ed for, at this point, a little over 20 years, but for the past 6 years, my focus has been on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and specifically Title IX. How I got into that role, I drew the short straw. I'm not sure. I'm a researcher by heart. I saw some things around 2011 and 2012 that showed that our institution needed to do some more work as they related to sexual misconduct issues and started looking into Title IX. At the same time, the Obama administration, particularly now President Joe Biden, had started to release some Dear Colleague letters around Title IX. And so I really started getting deep and heavily into the work of gender discrimination. But once that work started, I realized that there was more work to be done just across the board on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And so that's where I really started my focus on social justice and really starting to implement programmatic initiatives on campus that were proactive in nature and not just reactive and not just compliance related that a lot of times Title IX suggests, but really trying to change the breadth of the campus community and thinking about issues of respect and belonging and inclusion, because those things on the front end hopefully helps with these issues that we're about to talk about on the back end.
So our first question is, can you speak on your background as a researcher at Florida State University and your research interests.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Brendan Lantz. I'm an assistant professor and the director of the Hate Crime Research and Policy Institute at Florida State University in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice. I got my PhD from Penn State University. That's where I first started studying hate crimes. I was drawn to the study of hate crimes in particular because it's this interesting sort of, to me, an interdisciplinary nexus of 4 different research areas that I think are particularly important for understanding hate crimes. First, the social psychology behind the incident, right? You can't understand hate crimes without understanding the bias motivation, right? So you have to draw on that research. Second, we still ask the basic criminological questions, like why do they commit the crime? Then there's the important victimization effects, which are unique and we've been talking about a lot. And then there's the additional complexities that it introduces for the criminal justice system, right? That bias motivation introduces all kinds of complications, not only for the victim when they're deciding, do I report the crime? What do I do about the crime? But also for the police and for prosecutors when they're deciding whether or not to bring a charge or to follow through on the case. So I think it's a particularly interesting and important area of research right now.
Okay, this next question is from Ms. Bias. Can you define racial hate crimes?
Sure. And so a hate crime in and of itself has 3 components, well, 2 components really. It's a crime, and then 2, it's motivated by some sort of prejudice or bias towards another or a group. And so for it to be a racial hate crime, it's motivated particularly because of somebody's racial background, ethnic background, or national origin.
Thank you for that. Can you define discrimination and the difference between discrimination and a hate crime?
Sure. So discrimination is typically an act or an incident that's based on some sort of protected class and based off bias, very similar to hate crime. So the difference between the two is the word crime. Discrimination typically is more of an administrative violation and does not always constitute a crime. Usually I try to liken these things to the concepts of when we're looking at gender discrimination and the concept of what sexual misconduct is to rape. So when we're looking at discrimination, discrimination is an umbrella term over all discriminatory incidents, acts, and behaviors, much like sexual misconduct or sexual harassment. When we see a hate crime is really just the most severe or most violent act of discrimination, much like we see that sexual assault or rape is the most violent form of sexual harassment.
Can I jump in? Because this is what we're trying to do, like a conversation, right? One of the things that Jeanine is speaking to is that we have really conceptually distinct definitions of discrimination and hate crime. But one of the things that we see in the research is that line is often pretty blurry, especially for victims, right? So the victim's trying to figure out after a victimization happens, did this reach the threshold of being a hate crime? And that's one of the things that's particularly complex about responding to hate crimes for victims and then for actors in the criminal justice system. So I just wanted to speak to that a little bit because they're conceptually distinct, but often really blurry when people are trying to figure these things out.
Dr. Lantz, you bring up a good point, and I think that's what's frustrating for a lot of people is because I think before reporting, victims find themselves in a predicament of trying to distinguish if they've reached that threshold, which is really not the role of a victim. That's the role of law enforcement or district attorney's office or ultimately federal courts. We don't want our victims to concentrate on the definitions. We want our victims to concentrate on the healing process. But our definitions can start to get very convoluted and gray when we're talking about these things, particularly because you need to prove such things like motivation or being targeted. And that's very difficult sometimes.
Can you speak to explain like freedom of speech and its role in hate crimes?
Sure. So freedom of speech is really about somebody being able to articulate their ideas and opinions free of any sort of retaliation or consequence or legal ramifications. When we see this in the context of really US society right now, we're looking at a lot of things that people have a difference of opinions on, and people should be able to, and by constitution and by law, have that right to express those opinions very, very freely. There's only very few exceptions to freedom of speech, and those have to do with either incitement, defamation or libel, and sometimes obscenity. Other than that, there is not any, I guess, constraint to freedom of speech, which a lot of people really disagree with. They don't think that somebody should be able to say something and or express something really to you, but that is really a foundation of our Constitution. The other topic or the other word that comes up a lot is hate speech. Well, that's hate speech. Hate speech is not defined by law really anywhere. And so we get into this context where we're trying to apply both of those things together, hate crimes and freedom of speech. And while freedom of speech sometimes is a precursor to hate crimes, because maybe there is that incitement or there is some sort of context that gets somebody motivated to push forward with a hate crime, a lot of times there is not a direct link, but we can see the opinions of others start to become motivation for some and also start to blur that line to where people feel victimized even by people's words and not necessarily their actions.
I think it's really important when we talk about hate crime laws to start to think about free speech. Hate crime laws have been implemented for now just over 4 decades. They were first implemented in the beginning of 1981, but they've been challenged on free speech grounds on numerous occasions. And that's still one of those talking points that you hear today in terms of people that are trying to undermine or argue against having hate crime laws. Now, constitutionally, that was settled in 1993 in the case of Wisconsin v. Mitchell, when they said, no, hate crime laws are constitutional, and they do, even though they're covering biased motivation, which some people equate to thoughts, they are constitutional, and they have these additional elements to these crimes that make these laws necessary. These are still like challenges that we hear today when at the state level, when they're debating expanding protections or things like that. The one thing I will say is that while most speech does not constitute hate crime law, it can rise to that. If somebody was to say, I hate you, is free speech. The minute someone enters an action into that equation and says something like, I hate you and I'm going to kill you, yes, even if they don't actually kill you, adding that threat level can make it a hate crime. So it's, again, sort of that nuance.
I think also sometimes when people have or express and use their freedom of speech, that's been able to prove that motivation later. And so oftentimes when people are talking, whether it be at rallies, whether it be on social media, whether it be an email or hidden sites, oftentimes people have been litigated against for a hate crime because of previous things that could be seen as freedom of speech, but it starts to show a bias and their motivation towards that hate crime. And so they can work kind of opposite from each other, but they're oftentimes people don't realize that their speech and their opinions will give way to almost proving a hate crime if in fact somebody acts on those opinions.
Can you speak about the current legislation regarding hate crimes?
From my knowledge, the most kind of current hate speech legislation is still the James Byrd Act, and that was, I think, 2009, which talks about hate crime prevention and talks about really how to assist victims in their rights as far as reporting hate crimes and defining what they are. As far as anything current within the last 10 to 12 years, I'm really not familiar with.
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak to that a little bit. So at the federal level, the federal legislation passed, it covers race, ethnicity, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, U.S. Armed Services. But at the state level, these laws vary substantially. So right now, there's 3 states that don't have any hate crime law at all. That's Arkansas, South Carolina, and Wyoming. There's 1 state, Indiana, that technically has a hate crime law, but they have no actual enumerated protected categories. So it's yet to be seen exactly how that law is going to function in real life when it's used. And then at the state level, there's a lot of variation. So Florida, where I'm at, covers sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, national origin, but doesn't cover things like gender or gender identity. There's a lot of debate about that. Texas covers race, ethnicity, religion, national origin, gender, age, sexual orientation, but then doesn't cover things like gender identity, armed serviceness, or homelessness. So there's a lot of variation at the state level.
Since both of you work at universities, have you noticed any trends concerning hate crimes on college campuses?
I will say for me, because I deal specifically with grievances of discrimination, and even before that work, I dealt and worked in student conduct specifically. I don't necessarily see any trends and actions, but I do see a trend in the misunderstanding of the definitions, in where people speak to either hate speech that we just talked about, or people speak to being discriminated against when maybe the act wasn't necessarily discrimination. A lot of times we get caught up in headlines and hype, where we really need to get caught up in the body and the context of the work and truly understanding what's going on our college campuses. The other thing, when we talk specifically about hate crimes, remember, hate crime is defined mostly by it being a crime. So it being part of a penal code, it being part of something that is law enforcement. And on college campuses, we work in policy and administration. So it's sometimes a much broader effect. And so we don't adjudicate quote unquote hate crimes all of the time, but we do adjudicate discrimination or even racist and biased acts or incidents that might not rise to the level of a crime. And hopefully we can prevent it before it rises to a level of crime. Sometimes we look at things that are more unconscious bias in nature versus more explicit acts. And that's, the other big thing about, a hate crime versus discrimination. A lot of times discrimination is coming from a place where somebody does not know their biases, versus a hate crime or even a hate or bias motivated incident is somebody that knows that bias consciously and then decides to act upon it. So on college campuses, the trend that I've seen now is more in education and awareness versus acts actually occurring on campuses. Other than obviously some things like what's happened at Charlottesville, which wasn't it wasn't their students, it wasn't their administration, their faculty or staff that was community members using the college campus because it is a public institution in order to exhibit their freedom of expression. And so that's what the trend is on some campuses. And I'd love to hear Dr. Lantz's opinion as well.
I think you can probably honestly speak to that a little bit better than I can. In part, the problem that we have right now is there's so little research in hate crimes generally, but also especially hate crimes on campus. And I think that's a problem, not just for the reasons that Jeanine's talking about, but because campuses are so unique in the environmental and social context, because they're bringing together people from all these different backgrounds, from all these different racial, ethnic groups, and they're putting them in one space. And that can have, different effects, right? So on the one hand, you think there are plenty of theories that suggest that more exposure to other groups should decrease prejudice. And so we should see less of that on campus. But on the other hand, we see opportunity theory. So opportunity for victimization increases too. So we need a lot more research before I think that we can speak to that effectively.
What I can say that we do see is really an increase, probably not of the microaggressive behavior or acts and incidents that can be possibly deemed as discriminatory, but we're seeing reports on that. So whether it be a professor in the classroom that says something that's offensive to a group of people, or there is possibly textbooks that have been chosen in the classroom that students disagree with the content and provide, counter resources, or two roommates that have been roomed together that are from different backgrounds and have conflicts because of that. So with the rise of really diverse campuses and and diversity in all sorts of ways, not just diversity in color or gender, but diversity of thought and background, and especially in the state of Texas, rural versus urban and all sorts of things, we are seeing, as Dr. Lantz just described, this opportunity for one, learning, but there's also opportunity for incidents to occur and people to learn from them as they occur and have conversations and have difficult dialogue, so we can start to work on the process of not only just healing, but working together. And as I mentioned kind of in the beginning, working towards really instating a culture of respect to where we don't have to see or agree with each other on certain things, but we respect each other's opinion or respect the fact that people have opinions in the first place.
I think just to add one more quick thing, I want to speak directly to that idea that awareness is increasing. I think that's a really good point. So when I first started researching hate crimes, which was now like 10 years ago, it was considered a niche topic. Now, 10 years later, this is a hot button issue, and this is an area where there is tons of not just attention, but awareness, right? So people are probably thinking about these things more often, more willing to report them, more willing to, even when it's not quite reaching that level of a crime, they're willing to say it might be, and let's report it. So I think awareness is really going up.
So in reference to the racial justice protests and the protests at the Capitol, can you explain the victimization that comes from what is and is not deemed hate crimes?
So if I understand it correctly, we're looking and really trying to compare the racial justice or social justice protests from really May through August across the country in relation to different deaths of particularly people of color, and particularly at the hands of law enforcement, compared to the June 6th, what's been being called insurrection at the Capitol. Let's talk about the differences between the two and how people felt that participated in those protests that happened between May and August, and then seeing the insurrection at the Capitol and some of the biggest differences. For me, just personally seeing that, and there was an image that was circulated probably either on the 6th or the 7th that showed the National Guard being ready and prepared in August for a demonstration in Washington, D.C. Well ahead of the time of the protest was supposed to be started. That was part of their planning. Versus a known rally in the same context, a known rally on January the 6th, in which the National Guard was not called, or they said that we don't need that. As a practitioner that specifically studies unconscious bias, those decisions based on those two separate incidences is a perfect example of how bias starts to rear its head in policies, procedures, and politics. And in the fact that you have a group of people that on both sides, there were estimated attendance of tens of thousands of people. There should be policies that are across the board for any sort of protest in our nation's capital that say this is the procedure. Unfortunately, there wasn't. And so the procedure that was laid out was really based off of what people's minds thought of when they thought of a protest as it related to people of color versus a protest based off of people that supported President or past President Trump. And that really showed the inherent bias that we have as a culture in the United States. And I really think that over everything that's happened across the country in the last 4 years, that was really an eye-opening experience for a lot of people, where you had people busting windows into the nation's capital and committing trespassing because the Capitol was closed to onlookers. And it was a planned event at a time where the country, based on constitutional practices, was in the process of the transition of power and trying to stop that, versus not having a plan for that, versus having a plan for something that was just seen as a protest. So that's one. So that's the differences. Now, as it's not deemed as a hate crime, one of the biggest things between the two is, can we prove, particularly about the insurrection of the Capitol, that it was motivated by a prejudice against a protected class? And I think that that's one of the biggest things that's unfortunate, is because people can have and say that their motivations were strictly because election fraud or other political reasons, and not based off of their biases or motivations toward, as we were talking about before, race, gender identity, military status, all of those other sorts of things. Versus when we're looking at the protests and injustice that happened between May and August, we're looking specifically at racially motivated things. So that's why there's a separation between the insurrection that happened at the Capitol and the protests that occurred over the summer. But I think it's important to understand that we are comparing apples to oranges. When we're talking about the protests that happened, those were civil protests where some people did either riot or steal property, but that was not in large the intent of the protest, versus an insurrection or a coup on the Capitol that had a motivation to stop a legally constitutional process of the federal government. So a lot of times those two things should not be compared to each other because they are very different, and they're very different in the context of how we move our government forward. We need to look at the one things that I mentioned in the beginning of why the response or the pre-response and the proactive planning for the two events were treated differently, but the cause at the end, it needs to be seen very different, because one was a protest that was motivated by large inconsistencies and illegal acts of the government, versus the other one was motivated by false claims, as well as not motivated by necessarily any sort of race, but motivated by and incited by other political officials.
Yeah, I don't think I could add anything to that or say anything better than that. I think that's an excellent response. I just think it's important to boil it down and underline that it's hard to attribute those differential responses, given different motivations, to anything other than different racial compositions of those groups that are at those protests.
It's just a place that we've come to at our country where we have to actually start asking the question of who are we and who we want to be, and no longer under the context of that we're equal. We really need to either live the words in our documents that is about all the people that live in our country, or being resigned to the fact that those documents weren't written for everybody, and then rebuild a foundation to say that we still believe those truths and we want to rebuild this country based on those words, but based on the context of, we have people in this country that are different. We have people in this country that have come to this country for a different number of reasons, and we still believe in the words that our forefathers wrote.
Our next question is, can you explain the consequences that victims of hate crime suffer from, such as physically or psychologically or financially?
Sure, I can touch on that a little bit. And they're not always just consequences, but just long-term effects of being a victim of a hate crime or even discrimination. So physically, a lot of times we look at post-traumatic stress syndrome for a lot of people that have been victimized by either racially motivated or gender motivated or any sort of bias motivated hate incident or hate crime. So let's broaden it to not just something that's constituted as a crime, but also just any sort of hate incident. So PTSD, definitely one. Obviously, sometimes PTSD and other mental disorders also start to breed into physical ailments. So whether that being ulcers or stomach problems or weight loss, weight gain, also into depression and all sorts of things. And so just also in the context of not wanting to leave your house, not wanting to go to the same places that you were at before. These incidents can have long lasting effects really beyond just a couple of days or a couple of months, and can stay with somebody for years on end. As Dr. Lantz suggested, the research on this is few and far between, but much like other crimes that are associated with some sort of protected class, we could probably associate the same to hate crimes. Psychologically, the same thing. You start to think differently. There is possibly paranoia that sets in. You have a different sort of thought process in even doing simple things like going to the store or speaking with people. It affects psychologically also your ability to even work and work for different people. It affects your trust for people and relationships. So these incidents, if not handled properly, whether it be by healthcare providers or counselors, could really start to breathe into and cause really secondary victimization of the person, really beyond the incident itself. And then last but not least, financially, sometimes that does start to affect people's jobs, so they don't perform as well. But on the other end, if you are looking into pressing charges legally for a hate crime incident, could have a high financial impact on somebody, because it's difficult to prove a lot oftentimes, and the stakes are high. And for people on the criminal side, if they are up against enforcement of the law or going through the courts, I've seen oftentimes that people will appeal all the way until they can't appeal anymore, and that leaves our victim with having to pay those costs for attorney fees and everything else. And so that's just a lingering on. And as I said, the secondary victimization beyond just the initial incident, even if it just occurred for 1 hour or one part of a day, it has lasting effects for years.
Yes, I want to speak to that a little bit if I can. So I mentioned that case, that Supreme Court case, Wisconsin v. Mitchell, earlier when we were talking. I think that's really important to bring in here. So in that case, the court acknowledged essentially that there is some gray area in terms of hate crimes, in terms of punishing thought, right? They say the difference between a crime and a hate crime is the motivation. So there is some justification for making the argument that thought is involved in that legal punishment. But then they went on to say, that said, there are 3 reasons why these laws are necessary. And they said, first, hate crimes are often excessively brutal compared to other crimes, so they're more physically severe. They said hate crimes exert more psychological trauma on the victims. And there's pretty significant evidence for that. Not just incidents that rise to the level of a crime, but just exposure to discrimination has profound psychological impacts on the victims. And then they acknowledged that there are these, what we would call now interim effects, which is this wider community impact that doesn't just impact the victim, but what Jeanine was speaking to, essentially it makes people afraid to leave their homes. So if somebody is aware of a hate crime that happens to someone who looks like them or to someone who has the same beliefs as them, that has profound impacts on the victim, on that person too, because if you boil it down, they were victimized for no other reason than that characteristic, and so it could have been them, right? So those impacts are why the court said we need to have these laws, and that plays out in the research. More psychological impact, more physical impact, and then this broader community impact.
Dr. Lantz brings up a really good point on really not just the victimization of an individual, but the victimization of entire community. And in the fact that people sometimes don't understand in the protests, and well, why are people hurting so much? For me, for example, in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, just somebody running in a neighborhood. My husband runs all the time. And we were also a couple that when we do run or do walks, we have a neighborhood that's newly developed. So we would walk into houses and things like that. So when you see things on the news and you see things that could have been me, that starts to not only impact individuals, but communities of a whole, whether they be communities of color, LGBTQIA communities. We start to see and look over the shoulder and say, am I going to be next? And that's the victimization. And those are the things that we have to start looking at and trying to provide some sort of resources and services, because the incident itself is not just affecting the person, but it's affecting entire communities across the country.
The current statistics from the FBI for 2019 show that racial bias crimes continue to be the majority of hate crimes reported, specifically towards minorities such as African Americans and Hispanics. Have you noticed this trend in the research that you do?
Yeah, so those patterns are really robust. Year after year, officially reported hate crimes indicate that, in order, the 3 most frequent types of hate crimes are race, ethnicity motivated, religion, and most of those are anti-Semitic, and sexual orientation. And that goes back as far back as you want to look in the FBI hate crime statistics. That is what we see. I will say, though, that while those official statistics are really important for helping us to understand what's going on, especially what's proceeding through the criminal justice system and being tracked by law enforcement agencies, there's a lot of issues with relying only on officially reported hate crimes. So if we compare officially reported hate crimes to data from National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a nationally representative survey that asks people whether or not they've experienced a hate crime, we see that there are roughly 250,000 hate crime incidents in the United States every year. And the FBI on average is only counting somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000. So that's 3% of incidents that are showing up in those actual official statistics. And that's because of two basic patterns. First, victim underreporting. Victims, when they experience a hate crime, there's a lot of reasons why they might not report it. First, they might wonder to themselves, like we've already talked about to some extent, was this a hate crime? And if it doesn't quite rise to that threshold where they think I should report this, or this was definitely a hate crime, they may not. But also, it's important to realize that most of these hate crime victims come from historically marginalized and disenfranchised populations that might be reluctant to notify the police because they're worried about what kind of experience they might have when they interact with the police. So that's the first issue with those statistics. Only about 45% of hate crime victimizations are officially reported to the police. Second, once it's reported, that bias motivation introduces all sorts of complexities. So when law enforcement agencies are responding to these incidents, they have to ask themselves, was this motivated by bias? And even if they think it was, can I prove it? Then they have to collect that evidence. It introduces all sorts of additional complications. They have to go to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor has to decide whether or not there is enough evidence to bring that case. And we see very few hate crimes end up in those official statistics for those two reasons.
Have you noticed any changes concerning hate crime research in general?
So there's three sorts of areas that I want to talk to in regards to research areas that are getting a lot of attention right now. The first is the idea of political legitimization. So there's a lot of attention as of late to the role that political rhetoric can have on influencing the population that supports certain politicians, like former President Donald Trump, to engage in acts of bigotry or hate crime incidents. So we're seeing a lot of research that's finding that in the UK, for example, after Brexit, hate crimes went way up. Here, after political speeches by former President Donald Trump, we were seeing spikes in hate crimes. There was some research suggesting that places that had Trump rallies, we're seeing spikes in hate crime. So there's a lot of research right now looking into those political legitimization effects. There's also some debate right now about hate crime laws at the federal level that are intended to keep firearms and weapons out of the hands of hate crime offenders. So we see that a lot of hate crimes don't actually involve guns, but the ones that do tend to be exceptionally violent. So Bowers in the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, the El Paso shooting, they involved guns and a lot of death. So legislators have been active in trying to pass something called the Disarm Hate Act. And there's been some research looking at the use of guns. Our team's been doing some, and we're finding that guns do have an increased effects on violence. So we think it is important to try to keep guns out of the hand of potential hate crimes offenders. But that is not quite enough, because even when hate crime offenders don't have guns, they tend to be more violent than other offenders who don't have guns. So it doesn't go quite far enough, but it's an important. There's also a lot of research right now on data improvement and improving victim reporting because of how bad those hate crime statistics are. So there's a lot of efforts to understand what sort of interventions might help us to increase victim reporting. People are looking at things like third-party reporting centers, whether or not the ability to go to someone besides the police might increase reporting and help improve our hate crime statistics. So there's a lot of research in that area.
Do you think the pandemic will impact hate crime research, particularly garnering more research for agents within the criminal justice process?
Okay, so I think that's a great question. Right now, we're conducting some research on hate crimes during the COVID pandemic. So we administered a survey in May 2020 to approximately 4,188 respondents, and we asked them about their experiences with hate crime during the pandemic. We were specifically interested in whether or not it was disproportionately impacting Asians and Asian Americans, as the FBI warned about. So the FBI in February 2020 basically issued a statement that said, we expect this to go up. But data takes a long time, so we wanted to sort of get out in front and say, is this happening? So we administered this survey, and our results indicated that nearly 30% of Asians in the survey indicated experiences with discrimination during the pandemic, including racist insults and the refusal of services. More than 15% of Asian and Asian Americans in our survey indicated that they had been the direct victim of hate crime during the pandemic. This included experiences with racist threats, property damage, having objects thrown at them, being chased or followed, being punched, hit or kicked, being spat upon, and 8% of respondents even indicated being assaulted with a weapon. We see an even more wide-ranging impact when we expand our scope and then ask Asian respondents whether they fear victimization. So this is sort of speaking to some of the things we were talking about earlier in terms of fear of going out the door, or whether they change their behavior in any way to avoid possibility of harassment. And we see that nearly 60% of them say they avoid certain situations. Nearly 70% of them say they observe their surroundings when they go out. 55% of them indicate that they're more careful about their language or wording in public. 40% of them indicate that they're more careful about their appearance. And more than 20% of them indicate that when they go outside, they're preparing for insults. So we're seeing a wide-ranging impact on people changing their, Asian respondents in particular, changing their behavior because they're afraid of victimization during the pandemic. Even if they've not experienced bias, harassment, threats, or violence themselves, roughly 44% of Asian respondents indicated that they knew someone personally who had been victimized. So that's having that broader community impact and changing the way people behave during the pandemic. I think more generally, not just within the context of hate crime, but I think more generally, the pandemic might be one of those sort of watershed moments that lead us to ask more questions about Asians and Asian Americans within the criminal justice system. So right now, Asians represent only approximately 5% of the population, but they're also one of the fastest growing, and they're likely to have especially large population shares in coming decades. So we really, and it's a population that we really have not been looking at, and we really need to start looking at more. After 9/11, we saw that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate crime incidents went up dramatically. But what we didn't see is them go back down considerably. So they did go down some, but Islamophobia has been higher than pre-9/11 levels ever since. And it's possible that we might be talking about a similar watershed moment among the Asian population.
You know, Dr. Lantz, I wonder if there is also some interchange. You mentioned the Islamophobia and some other populations other than Asian, but with the pandemic, even with political travel bans that were placed due to the pandemic, but on countries that were mostly Muslim or religious based, even prior to bans placed on countries that had higher COVID numbers than those countries. I wonder if some of the research can even start to lend towards that, and the previous Islamophobia that was created from 9/11 continued in the pandemic, even through laws and travel bans and other things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So we're doing some work on sort of exploring the generalized effects of the pandemic on hate and hate crime right now. And we're seeing a lot of alarmingly high levels of xenophobia just across the board. The problem is the pandemic, there may have been some people, but we didn't see it coming, right? So we don't necessarily have a pretest. So we don't have like a comparison point, but we are seeing alarmingly high levels. One of the things that we do know from research is that this fear of other, or this xenophobia, tends to be heightened during periods of fear. And the pandemic, if nothing else, has made people more concerned about themselves and more fearful about the environment in general, right? So prejudice and xenophobia tend to be heightened and more salient when people are afraid. So I think it's likely that we are seeing these effects across the board.
Our last question is, do you guys have any further comments that you would like to add?
I mean, I can start. I think that, and I mentioned this before, our our country is at a crossroads in a lot of things. And it's very interesting. And based off of Dr. Lantz's research, we're seeing lots of things starting to even collide. We're talking about hate crimes, but we're also talking about pandemic. We're talking about social justice. We're talking about discrimination. We're talking about lots of things. And I think it's important, particularly as educators, that we start looking to those things that are related to each other so we can start educating our community and researching more and doing some things to talk about prevention and talk about moves forward versus continuing to rely on what's happened in the past. I think that there's a famous statue. It's of a bird. It's called the Sankofa, that their feet are planted forward, but the head is looking to the past. And so we do need to look forward, but we move forward, but we need to look to the past for some answers. And we're almost at this place of reckoning where we have to come up with solutions. We cannot continue in this way. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful with a lot of things that have come to the forefront at this point. Before, as a practitioner, we're dealing with assumptions and dealing with, I think this is happening, but I don't know. But over the past really 2 years, we have been faced with overt issues of hate crimes, discrimination, all sorts of things that is no longer hidden. So we have to provide the answers for it. And I think now is the time to do so.
I wish I had spoken first so that I didn't have to follow that. That was great. So I think from a research perspective, there are so many unique things about the last year, right? The social justice protests, the elections, COVID-19 pandemic. I think that hate crime researchers are likely going to be studying this past year for a long time. There's a lot of things that likely had significant impacts, both short-term and long-term, on the not just hate crime, but discrimination and more low-level racist incidents as well. One of the things that I'd like to underline, just because most of my research is on victim decision-making after the crime, and we're talking to a Crime Victims Institute here, is that we need better hate crime statistics. And to do that, we need better options for victims. So after the crime happens, the most important thing, if it is at all possible, is to turn to the police and tell them about the incident so it can be officially recorded, but also so that the offender can potentially be punished and the victim can get the resources. But it's normal and understandable that many victims wouldn't want to turn to the police, given racial, ethnic, minority tensions with police and history of interactions with police. So there are other options. There are local community organizations that are often taking reports on hate crimes. There are options to report the incidents anonymously. So organizations like the SPLC, Communities Against Hate, recently Stop AAPI Hate has started, and they're basically an organization that's trying to keep track of Asian American and Pacific Islander hate crime events during the pandemic. And it's not going to end up in official statistics, but it's going to get recorded somewhere, and then we can start to address it as a social problem. So there are other options if someone experiences a hate crime victimization and aren't comfortable going to the police.
We would like to thank Dr. Lantz and Mrs. Bias for taking the time to discuss hate crime victimization with us. We hope that this information will help others with awareness concerning hate crimes. Thank you for taking the time to watch and or listen to our CVI Talks presentation. Stay tuned for future CVI Talks. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for the latest and greatest concerning CVI.